Okay, so one of the most important roles of the kidney, obviously, and we started talking about this way back in endocrine system when we discussed the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, is of course controlling water loss and water reabsorption. So if you're creating about 180 liters of filtrate a day, obviously you're not losing all of that. So getting water back from the blood that you filter is a big, big deal. So if you were to do sort of an overview of water reabsorption in general along the entire nephron, with the, of course, notable exception of here, because we know that the ascending limb of the loop of Henle is not water permeable. This part is salt territory only. The osmosis that you see is just that, osmosis, meaning it is passive. So water is just following whatever else is being pulled from the filtrate. So that includes organic molecules, it includes ions, it includes buffers, all of that. Water is just kind of like an obnoxious little sibling that's like, well, I want to go too. It's going to. There are places in the nephron where water permeability can be adjusted, but not in the PCT and not in the descending loop. So water reabsorption here is what we call obligatory or obligate. So this means that water reabsorption in this portion is all going to happen here regardless of osmolarity changes in the interstitial fluid. Sorry, I had to sneeze suddenly and I did not want to scream sneeze into the microphone, so I moved it for a second. This portion, this obligate water reabsorption area, is responsible for about 85% of reclamation. So the water that you filter, 85% of it is reclaimed here. The rest, this is where ADH and aldosterone come into the picture. So this is going to change the concentration of your urine according to your body water and osmolarity needs. So we call this facultative. Facultative is an adjective that means based on one's choice. Now, obviously not your conscious choice. I can't sit here and be like, I would like my urine to be 1200 milliosmoles. Not something I'm capable of. But rather, this is controlled via your endocrine system. So much or how little is reabsorbed varies according to your needs. It's very precisely controlled. And we call this facultative water reabsorption. So one of the hormones that I haven't mentioned, because I've talked about antidiuretic hormone and I've talked about aldosterone pretty thoroughly, is of course atrial natriuretic peptides. So natriuresis still ends in uresis, and Na is the abbreviation for sodium, so natriuresis means loss of sodium in the urine, and water of course will follow. So I mentioned the aquaporins here. So basically this is just a slide to say, hey, if you put more places for water to leave the collecting duct, as it passes through the high osmolarity territory of the renal medulla, it will. So ADH is a very potent concentrator of urine, and in doing so, it raises blood volume because you're holding on to more water. So let's compare and contrast the absence versus the presence of antidiuretic hormone. If you look, I think the most obvious portion here is pay attention not to the nephron loop, because it's going to work the same way regardless of hydration, but rather to the collecting duct. So if you have adequate body water, so you're well hydrated, your blood volume's good, not much is going to happen here. So you're going to produce large volumes of dilute urine. So if you've been a very, very good person and you've been hydrating all day and just being really good about your water intake, you're going to be peeing larger volumes of more dilute urine. This is more reminiscent to a state of dehydration. So for most people's, day-to-day lives, think about like the first time you urinate after sleeping for a long time. So maybe you slept for maybe you're lucky and you slept for 8 or 9 hours. You haven't been drinking water that whole time, so your ADH secretion nocturnally is going to increase to keep everything normal while you're asleep, right? So you get up in the morning, yawn, stretch, walk to the bathroom, urinate. Because you haven't been drinking water all night, the volume of urine you produce is going to be small and the color of it's going to be brighter than usual. That's because ADH is active and we have aquaporins in the walls of the collecting duct. So consuming alcohol, specifically ethyl alcohol or ethanol, which is the alcohol that we drink, actually inhibits the secretion of antidiuretic hormone because alcohol is a nervous system depressant. So it prevents the release of ADH, causing production of large volumes of dilute urine in spite of dehydration. So that's what creates hangovers. And it's also the reason why people tend to urinate a lot while they are drinking. So here's a nice overview of the basically parts of the nephron and then what things are moving into or out of the nephron at each part. Now, obviously, there is not nearly as much detail in the PCT and the DCT as the slides I showed you previously. But it's a nice overview. So if you're looking for a place to sort of start organizing your thoughts about this system in preparation for lecture test, looking at this and then zooming in on one part at a time. So maybe looking at say the PCT and saying like, okay, so I'm going to look at this box and kind of go over this stuff, and then I'm going to take a closer look at what's going on here, and then you can zoom back out. So this is a good place to sort of circle your wagons and regroup to organize how you approach this, because I acknowledge urinary function and physiology is complicated, it's hard to understand, and there's a lot going on. So breaking it up into smaller bite-sized chunks is a good way to sort of tackle that in a way that's less intimidating. Because I promise you it's achievable, but it's going to feel really unachievable if you try and sort of absorb all of it at once. Okay, normal urine composition. One thing that everybody's done, assuming you've been to a doctor, is had to pee in a cup, and then typically, hopefully, in your doctor's office, there's a little window in the bathroom and you just stick your pee cup in the window, and then some mystery person takes your pee away and does stuff to it. And then you get a report saying what your urine reflected. So normal urine composition has a pretty variable pH because, of course, we're going to be either scrubbing bicarbonate or protons into our urine according to our buffering needs, right? So having a large variation in pH in urine is totally normal. It also is going to vary a lot in osmolarity because, of course, our osmolarity needs and our water needs are going to change. So accordingly, its total water content is going to change. One thing that doesn't change is that urine is mostly water. So us, as vertebrates, and the kind of vertebrates that we are, we must excrete water along with our waste products. We don't have a choice about that, which is why we are dependent on hydration. Depending on how hydrated you are, you can produce anywhere between just under 1 liter and 2 liters per day. And the average color should be transparent, so not cloudy. Cloudy is not a good sign. And clear to yellow. There should be no bacteria unless a UTI is present. However, this doesn't account for bacteria that occupy the distal end of the urethra, and the prepuce of the penis, if present, and the vulva, if present. So just because there shouldn't be any bacteria in the urinary bladder or in the kidneys doesn't mean that you won't find it in the urine, because it can hitch a ride on the way out. So this idea that urine is perfectly sterile, not quite true. So let's discuss urine transport, elimination, and storage. So as I mentioned, the kidneys are retroperitoneal, meaning they sit on your back body wall, and they're somewhat protected by your 11th and 12th ribs, as you can see from this scan here. So it's not like they're super vulnerable, but you can see the bottoms of them are definitely unprotected by your thorax. So they're a little bit more vulnerable to trauma for that reason. So right off the tip of each of your renal papillae, you have calyces. That's the plural of calyx. And you can actually see the minor calyces here. The ureter which all of the calyces converge in the renal pelvis, which is this little area here, and then the pelvis narrows to become the ureter. So the ureters carry urine down to the bladder. The urinary bladder is where you store urine. So some animals literally do just walk around sort of dribbling urine wherever they go. They don't have control over urination. Fortunately for us, that's not our way of being, which enables humans to do cool things like wear pants and decide when not to pee, which is, a talent I very much enjoy. So bladder is going to be storing the urine until it's a contextually appropriate time to urinate. And then the urethra is a muscular tube that eliminates the urine. The medical term for the process of eliminating is micturition. So we discussed the defecation reflex at the end of the digestive system, and it's important to also discuss the urination reflex, or the process of micturition. So just as the defecation reflex has an autonomic and a somatic component, so one part that you cannot control and one part that you can, same deal with urination. So the urinary bladder sits in the base of the pelvis. Here we have a male bladder, and here we have a female. So the internal urethral sphincter for both is part of the detrusor muscle, which is the thick layer of muscularis that expands and contracts to store or avoid urine. So the internal urethral sphincter is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The external urethral sphincter is controlled by the urogenital diaphragm, aka the pelvic floor. So if you are experiencing an urge to urinate and you are, quote, holding it, unquote, what you're doing is contracting your pelvic floor. You don't really have any say over what your internal urethral sphincter is doing. So let's discuss the urinary reflexes. There are baroreceptors inside of the bladder, and a baroreceptor is a stretch receptor, which makes sense if you're going to have like a, urine storage area. The more volume of urine is in there, the more stretched the walls will be, and that's going to stimulate the autonomic nervous system and provide it with information about when it's time to pee and how badly you have to do it, right? So the minimum amount of urine, which is enough to stretch to initiate just the starting of needing to urinate, is 200 milliliters. So if you happen to have a measuring cup in your home that has milliliters, pour 200 milliliters into that cup and look at it, and that's the amount that's necessary to begin that urge. I think you'll find it's pretty small. So conscious control over urination, which is conscious control over one's pelvic floor, is going to determine when we actually urinate. So we have two sets of reflexes here, and one of them is the urinary storage reflex. So interestingly, this is a difference between the defecation reflex and the urinary system. There isn't a fecal storage reflex, no such thing. There is a urinary storage reflex, interestingly. So there's a little bit of a sort of a neural asymmetry here. So we're going to look at both in turn. So the urinary storage reflex is what it sounds like. So although the bladder is being stressed and stretched, for whatever reason, it's not a contextually appropriate time to urinate yet. So, up to a point, stretch in the bladder is going to inhibit the bladder wall. It also is going to stimulate the internal urethral sphincter. So the smooth muscle at the exit is going to contract, and the rest of the detrusor is going to be inhibited. So in the pons, pontine is the adjective that we use to refer to the pons. The pontine storage center which is a nucleus in the pons, descends into the sacral spine, so all the way down, and synapses on a lower motor neuron. And this is in fact a somatic motor neuron, but it's part of a reflex arc. So remember from our discussion of reflex arcs that although we normally think of our skeletal muscle as being voluntary, in the context of reflexes, it isn't always. So sometimes other parts of the nervous system can override our voluntary control of skeletal muscle to achieve some function, and this is one of those. So the pontine storage center is going to basically just ping the external urethral sphincter with impulses to increase the tone of your pelvic floor muscle to hold in your urine. So this is a time during which urine storage is continuing and urine can't be passed. Urine voiding reflex is the opposite. So after a certain point, once you have sufficient stretch where the level of signaling that is coming from the detrusor baroreceptors reaches a threshold beyond which it's like, okay, now it's time to pee. Like the bladder is really full. We're getting to the point where additional storage is going to start to damage the detrusor, so we got to go now. We've all been there. We all know how uncomfortable it is when you really, really have to go, right? So those stretch impulses are relayed to another center. So over here's the storage center. Here's the pontine micturition center. So notice there's a decussation here as well. So the same thing is happening on the other side. It's not the case that the pontine micturition and storage center are on one side of the pons. They're on both. It's just that here's the pathway just simplified a little bit. So the pontine micturition center is stimulated by increasing stretch. And then it sends efferent impulses down, and it's going to inhibit the inhibition of the detrusor. So it's going to stop inhibiting the detrusor. So it has a permissive effect on the detrusor is what we call that. And it's going to relax the internal urethral sphincter. So opposite of what the pontine storage center does. So the detrusor is going to begin to contract. It's disinhibited, it's permitted to contract. So that sends an impulse down here into interneuron territory in the spinal cord. And the pontine micturition center is going to modify that by encouraging detrusor contraction and also inhibiting pelvic floor contraction, so causing the relaxation of the pelvic floor. So the result is that if you voluntarily choose to participate in this, so there's already relaxation occurring and then you can choose to do it further, urination occurs. So to give you an example of times when voiding versus micturition happens, I used the example of sleeping earlier. So one thing that happens when we sleep is that filtration and urine production don't stop. So as we're sleeping, pressure in the bladder is going to build up and up and up. And you better believe that 200 milliliters worth of stretch is not enough to wake most people up. So oftentimes when you get up in the morning, one of the reasons is, well, you really have to pee. So what's to prevent you from urinating during the night in between that 200 milliliters and whatever you end up urinating when you wake up? Well, this reflex. So this brings me to the idea of continence versus incontinence in children. In addition to behavioral changes in kids, so, learning to use the potty and learning to control one's pelvic floor, which is a skill, there's also an element of neural coordination that is not completely finished in young kids. So their storage reflex is intact, but it's still forming. And the end of it that they can control, they haven't mastered yet. So there's a combination of things going on. So while an adult with a mature storage reflex might not wet the bed, kids are more likely to. The voiding reflex again, something we learn to control at this end, not so much at this, but again, holding it versus not is a learned skill. So this is what we do when we're potty training kids, to associate the sensation of needing to urinate with a specific set of behaviors. And it's not something that a lot of them master right away. Okay, so the incontinence is the word for the inability to control urination. Now, the exact etiology of this, etiology meaning the underlying cause, it really depends. So you guys just saw two pretty complex sets of feedback loops that regulate either storage or voiding of urine. What that should mean to you by now is that the more complex the feedback loop, the more places it could break to result in a problem. And that's true. So if you get damage to a sphincter, either internal or external urethral sphincter, for example, or decreased muscle tone, this may cause leakage with increased intra-abdominal pressure. So really, really common way that this top one occurs is childbirth. So let's go back and look at the urinary anatomy of the female pelvis. First things first, we got the uterus, which is literally sitting tipped forward on top of the bladder. So during pregnancy, pregnant ladies have a little person sort of tap dancing around on their bladder. This is why we need to let pregnant ladies go in front of us to the bathroom. Always, always, always. But you also have to pass a baby out of here. And I don't know if you noticed, but babies are real big. So that tends to damage the pelvic floor sometimes and create changes in the pelvic floor musculature, which can result in loss of muscle structure or tone in the pelvic floor that causes urinary incontinence post-childbirth. Now, obviously, not all births result in damage to the pelvic floor that is sufficient to cause leakage, but for a lot of women, that's a very real thing. Damage to nervous system as well. So, for example, if for some reason the central nervous system supply to the external urethral sphincter is lost, so there's some sort of damage to the sacral spinal nerves, so maybe somebody experiences some spinal trauma in that area. If it's the external one, that results in a issue called automatic bladder. Automatic bladder means you don't get to control the pelvic floor at all. So urination occurs when the detrusor muscle is stimulated by the autonomic nervous system to void. So you don't get to hold it. It's not that you're always urinating, but your bladder just goes when it's time for it to go. Damaged pelvic nerves, these can cause a distended bladder because the regulation that disinhibits the internal urethral sphincter is damaged. So that causes inappropriate filling and also can coincide with continual leaks. So your bladder is consistently too full, and because it's consistently too full and it's putting pressure on a damaged sphincter, it's also constantly leaking. So there are many ways to come by incontinence. There's no one way that it occurs, but it can happen for a lot of reasons. It's actually a lot more common than you might think. So, I always like to say in-person classes, because we have a large range of ages and experiences in our course, that it may seem tempting to make jokes about, adult incontinence underwear, for example. I can think of a lot of times when I've heard people use depends jokes, but it's not really appropriate because you never have any idea what, people around you are going through with regard to their ability to control this or not. So be nice, be kind. All right, so that is it for lecture. Woohoo, that's the end of it. So